Hello again. Right triangle trigonometry is what we're doing, and in this particular lesson what we're doing is we're trying to identify what a hypotenuse, a opposite side, and an adjacent side of a triangle are. And I've got two triangles here. I tried to draw them as identical as I could. They're pretty terrible, but what are you going to do? Anyways, I want to figure out what the opposite, the hypotenuse, and the adjacent side of a triangle are. And what this really helps me identify is how to work with trig functions. There's 6 main trig functions that we work with. I'll get to that later. We're going to work with hypotenuse, adjacent, and opposite for now. So I've got this little symbol here. It's a Greek letter. I believe it's Greek. It's called theta. I've got it here. It's called theta. Now that's not a mistake. I meant to draw it on 2 different parts. One here and one here. And we'll get to that momentarily. But basically what theta means is, it just means like an angle. When I end up doing this later on, I'm going to plug in an angle measure, or actually a radian measure for that matter too. I'll get to that, don't get scared about that. And basically, you know, like 60 degrees, or 30 degrees, or 20 degrees, or 40 degrees, whatever. I don't know. That's not important right now. What's important is identifying what side is what. And I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to do something really quickly. Don't get scared. But I'm going to write down values for this triangle. Just arbitrary values. Well, it's not arbitrary, it's actually a Pythagorean triple. I'm going to call this bottom side, I'm going to take an approximation of what it is. I'm going to say it's 3 units. Okay, let's call that 3 units too. I'm going to call this one 4 units. I'm going to call this one 4 units. I'm going to call this 5. I'm going to call this 5. First of all, you can't really do that unless you know that it's a Pythagorean triple. It is. What that basically means is, if I plug this into, or substitute this into the Pythagorean formula, 1 leg squared plus another leg squared has to be this leg squared. 4 squared plus 3 squared has to be 5 squared. This is 16 plus 9, it is equal to 25. So I'm not just making values up with my head. And this theta here, we'll get to that. But what I want to do is locate what the opposite, the hypotenuse, and the adjacent side of our triangle are. Now, for those of you who remember your geometry facts, you say, well, is the hypotenuse the longest side of a triangle? And a 90-degree triangle? I'm like, yeah, it is. It's the longest side of this 90-degree triangle. And people say, oh, that's easy, it's 5. But then the question comes up, what happens if the numbers weren't here, like they weren't a minute ago? How would you know which side is the hypotenuse? And somebody says, I think it's the one that's opposite the 90 degrees. I say, yeah, that's exactly what it is. It's the one opposite 90 degrees. It's the longest side, but if you're not given the numbers, it's just the one that's opposite this 90 degree spot. So the 5 in this particular case is the hypotenuse. Hypotenuse. I really hope that's right. Somebody said, oh, okay, so that's the hypotenuse too. I'm like, yeah, good job. If I spelled it wrong, sorry. Now, I asked him, well, what's the opposite side and what's the adjacent side? And this is where people get muddled, confused. And they said, nobody knows. And I said, okay, there's actually a really cool trick here. This theta right here actually identifies the opposite side. We're working with this theta and we want to figure out what side's opposite this theta, this angle measure. I said, what's opposite? This 4 or this 3? Which one is, opposite away from it? And say, oh, the 4 is opposite because this is here and that's there. I'm like, yeah, good job. And then everybody gets excited and they say, oh, that's a 4 too. I'm like, no, it's not. And that's why I drew this triangle. The 4 is not opposite because now I put the theta here. So what side's actually opposite the theta? And this time, it's the 3. Oh, I see why you did that. Tricky. I'm like, I wasn't trying to be tricky, I'm just trying to show you something. There's 3 sides to a triangle. There's the hypotenuse side, there's the opposite, and there's the adjacent side. And I never tell my students to figure out what the adjacent side is first, or locate the adjacent. I just say, figure out your hypotenuse and opposite, and by theory of, deduction, I suppose, the last side is your adjacent. So in this case, 3 is the adjacent, and, there it is, 4 is the adjacent. Now what we're going to do is we're going to use this information on both triangles to figure out the 6 trig functions. We're not going to get ahead of ourselves. We're going to kind of do it, step by step by step, and eventually we'll get into inverse or arc, functions, etc. We'll see how that goes. But with that said, that's enough for right now. Have a good day. Goodbye.